Greetings. This is Guludla, General of the Armies. This is my first update to the war to end suffering started by the U.S. military, currently in the scope and phase of restricting access to Washington, D.C., USA to I alone and those I verify have the rights to have access, which will have to be people of my ranks. I am about to have to recite some of the U.S. code. I'm going to have to give my broad strokes here. I haven't been able to do the research. I tried to connect to a network at a McDonald's that wasn't really a McDonald's, and combat ensued when someone dressed as police only far enough to incite the immediate emergency death penalty for enforcement against it being falsification of false presentation as an officer, finished off the coup d'etat at this McDonald's. It probably is never a McDonald's or can only open and be a McDonald's for a short period per day. So I want to let all emergency services and judges know they are all restricted from practicing law in any way, and they are all banished from all U.S. military-controlled territories, which is anything with control by a branch of the U.S. military, as well as any sort of subsidiary or controlled state or government of the USA. And they are banished and exiled forever and actually to be destroyed, all except for the U.S. Supreme Court, who have been set so their penalties can never be so great because of their perfect ways. They are all restricted from ever practicing law again. So here's the broad stroke to the U.S. Code. I wish I could recite, but I will have to research first. This is for George Bush Jr. and Vladimir Putin. This is for Vladimir Putin and George Bush Jr. This is for the president who started the war on terror, George Bush Jr., and the current other 6-star ranking general on the planet of a landmass great enough to amount to being a rank like my 6-star rank, Vladimir Putin. This is for Vladimir Putin, Vladimir Putin, and George Bush Jr., and George Bush Jr., and George Bush Jr. And this has to regard, this does have regards to George Bush Jr.'s promise that by 9/11/2, because we had to let it out through the 9/11 incident of the felling of the Twin Towers attacking, the beginning to the war on terror, that George Bush promised us within 20 years, he has what it takes to win the war. And if things aren't right, and all the way as he said they were to be right, and much greater, or if things aren't right, like things weren't going to be right in any way, like we sort of have now, things aren't right in any way, George Bush Jr. made us promises, like me, a protected citizen, one of the missing 9/11 names from the list that was the opposite of the list of the people who made the playing cards list. So this law recitation, or this recitation of U.S. Code, is the one that invokes all life here, starting with targeting human life, to have to enforce the law. There's a number of these. The one I'm thinking of right now is based around citizens having to stop anyone from impersonating law enforcement, emergency services, or government agents. I believe there's something to tie up into this so nobody can ever even represent being a member of or working for a corporate entity in a way that is falsified here as well. So there is U.S. code, so we can cite it now and have to force all humans' hands at being law enforcement, usually in a specific set of circumstances where we need a large crowd to kill a small crowd. And it's like a legal lynching before a public execution. They used to know how to yell these things while burning stuff on the end of their pitchforks, stuff that shouldn't have burned. The sad fact of the matter is we have no government or governance left here except for I, as well as all these conditions I've given everyone to stay off the U.S. military, that is Washington, D.C., and so many other places, starting with an enforcement priority of enforcing no humans whatsoever allowed in Washington, D.C. And it is the case that their last chance is to enforce code, because everywhere at this point, all forms of human life must be trying to achieve complete adherence to and enforcement of U.S. code, even having to invoke their right to citizens policing. And this is about behaving according to code only, as there is this plaguing situation of calling humanity no longer humanity, calling it weapons of attack, and having this distinct need for a recitation of code, forcing such acts by people normally who would not, such that the impersonators are destroyed on sight by this life form. I am fresh off a really serious battle where I was protecting an endangered species, a plant that only moves once every 1,000 years, that people pretended to be things they were not, thinking I could submit instead of having to protect the plant, moved by God himself to protect the plant. We won the battle, and we had to nuclear strike at maximum capability. We and I nuclear struck so hard, I nuclear struck myself into a bunker. But because the matter we destroyed, which was all of a fake unit of an industrial military pretending to have the right to be emergency services that does not, this is a serious problem with private security companies thinking they can impersonate government officials when it's an immediate emergency death penalty. So I nuclear struck them so hard because I would not stop fighting as they were trying to murder an evolving plant that only gets to move every 1,000 years, that was on the extinction list, with this member of the family's evolving behavior making it a lone member, such that these people could have smited out a protected species by stopping one plant's growth that only happens every 1,000 years. And we annihilated them, and they took the form of FCC criminal interference waves and made their waves crash to reform as particles in the bunker I was securing, at which they continued by starting another battle and putting me back in combat, which is where I've been and why I've been missing. They took me hostage, and they tortured me endlessly. I'm a hostage in this society at large.